Hello, what's up guys? Welcome to the 16th tutorial in the series, the basics of programming in Python. Today we're going to be talking about variable scoping. Now let's get into it. Okay, so what is variable scoping? This is simply a way of controlling which part of your program has access to different variables, which means not every part of your program has access to every variables as you might have been thinking. Cool. And these scopes are just like context. You can think of it like context in which named references are checked. Named references in the terms of variables are checked. Though whenever your code is terminated, these scopes are also terminated. Okay, now let's get into what this is actually. So when we talk about global variables, you're talking about the ones you define at the top level like this, and when you're talking about local variables, you can have one in function, classes, or stuff like that. Okay, we'll talk about classes later on in this series. Okay, now let's move on to how global scopes can be accessed in the local scope. Okay, so I told you this is what you mean by global scope variables. So these are the global variables, and then we can access this from almost everywhere in our code. Okay, so we can also access it in this function. Now let's save it and run it. Okay, I just run it already, yes, to make sure the code is working fine. And now if I uncomment this and run it, we will see what will happen. I just put this down so you know that this doesn't affect our function doesn't actually run till it is called, so it won't return an error about this because this was not defined before the definition. Okay, now let's run it and see. And we have local, which is this local in a ljk, which is accessing this variable. So if I change to 51, the same happens here. Okay, we talked about how global variables can be accessed in local scope. Now how can local variables, I told you local variables are the one you define in function and stuff like that, so how can they be accessed in global scopes? No, they cannot be accessed in global scope unless you want it to be really possible, which we'll talk about that later. Okay, but by default you can't do this. And by the way, local scopes cannot use other local scope. What I mean by this is if you have a function, so let's define a function called bar. Define bar. Okay, so let me show you that local, this cannot be accessed. We're going to save this and run it. So we're going to comment this rather. Okay, so when I say local scope variables cannot be accessed in the global scope, this is what I mean. If I try printing, even after calling my function, try printing in a, okay, let me comment all this so we don't run it. If I print in a L, in a, okay, there's no need to print that again. Okay, so we have it here already. If I print this, all this now, we'll be expecting this to print it from this, but it's not going to do it because this is a local scope. These are local scope variables. If I run this and see, it will give us an error. In a K is not defined. Okay, now LJ, okay, I typed it correctly. So now you're saying it's telling us it's not defined. Oh, I made that mistake. Why? Okay, oh my, that's from that mistake. That error is from the function, not global scope. So we're gonna run it now. Okay, so in our L is not defined as we expected. As you can see, it's not running it, which means our code here cannot access the variables here. That's what I mean by local scope variables, so, which means these variables are just inside here and cannot be used outside of here. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about how different local scope variables cannot access their variables. Which, what I'm saying is, essence is that if you have a variable called bar and you have inner L here, you assign it to 100, and then we call full. Then we're gonna print inner L. We're gonna print, okay, I'm gonna print it just after here. Normally what would we expect is that when we run our code, we print 100 here, then we call our function. Yes, you can call functions and functions. So when we call this function, then we trigger this. But normally we're expecting that this inner L is redefined here, and then this inner L here is changed to 20. But in this case, Python just goes into this function, creates its own scope for this function, then prints this, and then once I told you, once the code is destroyed, the code once the code is terminated, the scopes are also destroyed. So at this point in time, the scopes are destroyed, and then it go back and prints the 100. That's what it does basically. Now let's see what happens. We're gonna run this instead and see. Now we see we get 100, this and this, and it says in a L is not defined. Okay, yeah, okay, I was wondering where the error came from. This is where the error came from, because we don't have any global variables here yet. I've commented it, but as you can see, we have 100, and the local variable, we ran this, we printed this local, and then we got this. Okay, cool. Now how can we use our local variables in the outer scope? I told you we can't use it unless you really want to use it, although the only way you can use it is by using the global function, the global statement, pardon me. Okay, now how do you use the global? You basically use the global statement by just using the global keyword, which is the global, this, and then you put the variable you want to be accessed in the global scope outside here, just right in front of it. So if I want inner L to be able to be accessed in the outer scope, in the global scope, I can just put inner L and comma inner J and inner K. So if I run this, we notice now this error is not going to be anymore. We're just going to make this global, and then it makes this, we assign this. You don't have to assign variables before making global. You have to make it global first, and then you assign it. I hope you get that. You make it global first, and then you assign it. Python knows that it handles that. Okay, so if you run it, we aren't going to get that error anymore. Now the variables are global. Okay, you know, I told you global scope variables can be accessed in local scope, as I showed you earlier. If I uncomment this now, just want to show you something quick thing, and I run it, we're not going to get any error, which is because this is global. Okay, but in this case, though we can access local scope variables, let me clear this and do that inside here. I'm gonna print in J. If I run by here, we're gonna print this 50 here. As you can see, we get this 50, but since we can access it here, can we modify it here? No, we can't modify it here. If you try modifying it, Python is gonna think you're creating your own name reference in this scope, and then you want to modify it, so to throw an error. Let me show what I mean. We're gonna do x equals to, oh, sorry about that, inner J, right, inner J equals to inner J plus 1. In this case, when we try to modify it, though we can access it, but we cannot modify it inside our local variables and local scope. Okay, so we're gonna try run it. You see unbound local error, local variable in J reference before assignment. So it was thinking you're trying to assign this here, and then trying to print it before you assign it, so it's like confused. But you can always print your global variables in here and do stuff with them, but assigning or modifying them, modifying them is not possible. As you can see in this case, we modified it, but now it's useless. To be able to modify it as I did earlier, you have to reassign it, and which gives us an error. Okay, so that's it for this video. Nothing else. If you like the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Peace, guys.